Attacked at the Sally House. The limestone walls of Atchison, Kansas hold a coldness that the prairie sun cannot reach. In this small town where the Missouri River winds like a slow, dark ribbon, stands a modest brick house on North 2nd Street. To a passing stranger, it looks like a relic of the late 19th century, sturdy, unassuming, and quiet. But the air around the property feels heavy, as if the oxygen has been replaced by the weight of a 100-year-old secret. Inside, the shadows do not behave according to the laws of light. They cling to the corners of the ceiling, and they watch. They are waiting for a specific kind of guest. They are waiting for the men. The legend of the Sally House is not one of a vengeful widow or a spectral soldier, but of a child. According to the documented lore of the town, the haunting traces back to a young girl named Sally who died on the operating table in the front room of this very house. In the early 1900s, the home served as the residence and office of a local physician. Sally was brought there by her frantic mother, suffering from a severe case of appendicitis. The doctor, fearing the organ would rupture, did not wait for the anesthesia to take full effect. Sally's final moments in the world of the living were defined by the cold bite of a scalpel and a blinding, white-hot agony. She died believing the man trying to save her was the man who was torturing her. For decades, the house remained relatively quiet, a slumbering vessel for a trauma that refused to dissipate. It wasn't until the early 1990s that the house truly woke up. A young couple, Tony and Deborah Pickman, moved into the residence, unaware that they were stepping into a territorial battleground. From the very first night, the atmosphere shifted. The temperature would plummet in the nursery, dropping 20 degrees in a matter of seconds. Strange smells, the metallic scent of blood, and the sterile odor of old medicine would waft through the hallways. But the entity in the house wasn't interested in Deborah. It had fixed its sights on Tony. The escalation began with subtle pranks. Objects would move across the kitchen table when Tony was alone. He would hear the soft, rhythmic patter of small feet running across the floorboards upstairs, followed by a giggle that sounded less like a child and more like a warning. Then came the physical contact. It started as a phantom touch, a cold hand brushing against his neck in the middle of the night. But as the weeks passed, the touch turned violent. The spirit of the little girl, or whatever was masquerading as her, began to manifest a visceral, burning hatred for the man of the house. During one dinner, while friends were visiting, Tony felt a sharp, stinging sensation across his back. He pulled up his shirt to reveal 3 long, bright red welts, as if a small hand with jagged nails had raked across his skin. There was no explanation. He hadn't been near anything sharp. The marks were fresh, weeping, and hot to the touch. This became the Sally House's signature. It was no longer a haunting of sightings and sounds. It was a haunting of physical assault. The entity was marking him, claiming his flesh as a canvas for its eternal resentment of the doctor who had failed it. One evening, at approximately 10:15 p.m., the activity reached a terrifying crescendo. Tony was in the basement, a dark, damp space with a dirt floor that seemed to swallow the light from his flashlight. The air down there was thick with the smell of wet earth and decay. He felt a sudden, oppressive pressure on his chest, making it difficult to breathe. He tried to turn back toward the stairs, but his feet felt heavy, as if he were walking through waist-deep water. Then, the burning started. It wasn't just a scratch this time. It felt like someone had pressed a branding iron against his torso. He cried out, stumbling toward the light of the kitchen above. When he reached the safety of the living room and lifted his shirt, his wife gasped. Across his chest were dozens of scratches, crisscrossing in a chaotic pattern. Some were thin and shallow, while others were deep enough to bead with blood. They formed a frantic, angry map of pain. As they watched, new marks began to appear in real time, appearing under the skin like invisible ink being heated by a flame. There was no one near him. The room was empty of anyone living, yet Tony was being shredded by unseen fingers. The horror angle of the Sally House is the realization that the entity isn't just a confused child. Investigators who have spent nights in the house describe a dual presence. There is the girl, Sally, who is often seen in a pinafore dress clutching a teddy bear, But behind her, or perhaps using her image as a mask, is something much older and more sinister. This darker force thrives on the fear of men. It watches from the top of the stairs, a shadow taller than any man, with eyes that do not reflect light. When male visitors enter the nursery, they often report a feeling of intense nausea, followed by the unmistakable sensation of being watched by something that wants to tear the skin from their bones. One investigator in the mid-90s recounted a session at 3 a.m. in the nursery. He sat in the center of the room with a tape recorder, asking questions into the silence. He felt a sudden icy breeze pass through his hair. He joked nervously about the cold, trying to maintain his composure. Within seconds, he felt a violent shove against his shoulder that nearly knocked him off his chair. When he looked at his arm, he found a circular bruise already forming, the size of a small child's palm, but with a strength that suggested a muscular, adult force. The audio recording from that night captured a low, guttural growl that no human throat could produce, followed by a child's voice whispering a single word, "Get out." The house has a way of isolating its victims. Even when the room is full of people, the man being targeted feels as though he is in a void. The sounds of the outside world, the cars on North 2nd Street, the wind in the trees fade into a muffled hum. All that remains is the sound of his own heartbeat and the realization that he is being hunted in a space that should be a sanctuary. The scratches often appear in sets of 3, a mockery of the Holy Trinity that is common in demonic hauntings, suggesting that the little girl may be a facade for something far more predatory. By the time the Pickmans finally fled the house, Tony's body was a map of scars. He had suffered over 20 documented physical attacks. The scratches would often heal with unnatural speed, disappearing within 24 hours, only to be replaced by new ones the moment he stepped back across the threshold. The psychological toll was even greater. He began to have dreams of the operating table, feeling the phantom slice of the doctor's knife, experiencing the terror of a child who realizes the person meant to help them is the one causing the pain. Today, the Sally House remains a site of pilgrimage for those who wish to test their bravery, but the warnings remain unchanged. Women and children often walk through the rooms with nothing more than a slight chill or a sense of sadness. But for the men who dare to enter, the experience is different. They speak of a lingering dread that follows them home, a feeling of being marked. Some have reported finding scratches on their backs days after leaving Atchison, as if the entity had hitched a ride, waiting until they were vulnerable in their own beds to remind them of its presence. The house stands silent now, its dark windows reflecting the Kansas sky. But if you stand on the sidewalk long enough after the sun goes down, you might see a small shadow move past the upstairs window. You might hear the faint sound of a girl crying, or the heavy, rhythmic thud of something much larger pacing the floorboards. The limestone walls remember the screams of 1906, and the entity inside remembers the face of every man who has ever entered its domain. It is a house that does not forgive, and it is a house that never forgets the feel of skin beneath its claws. Next story. The Feral Shadow of the Smokies. The Great Smoky Mountains sit like a heavy green spine across the border of Tennessee and North Carolina. To the casual observer, the rolling peaks and misty valleys are a sanctuary of natural beauty. But locals know that the deep woods are ancient, indifferent, and unforgiving. Beneath the thick canopy of oak and pine lie dense, impenetrable thickets of rhododendron known by mountaineers as laurel hells. These tangled traps are so tightly woven that daylight barely touches the forest floor, creating a subterranean world of perpetual twilight. It is a landscape that can swallow a person whole without leaving a single trace. It was Father's Day weekend, mid-June of 1969. The Martin family, along with a few friends, had trekked up to Spence Field, a high-elevation grassy bald offering sweeping views of the surrounding wilderness. Among them was William Martin, his father Clyde, and William's 2 young sons. The youngest was Dennis, a bright, energetic boy of 6 years old wearing a bright red t-shirt that stood out sharply against the deep greens and earth tones of the Appalachian summer. It was supposed to be a weekend of bonding, a simple camping trip to escape the noise of the valley below. By 4:30 in the afternoon, the adults were resting on the grass, watching the children play. The boys had hatched a plan to sneak up and startle the adults. 3 of the older boys went one way, while 6-year-old Dennis, wanting to be part of the game, slipped behind a large bush on the edge of the clearing. It was a harmless childhood maneuver. The distance from the adults to the bush was less than 50 feet. The older boys jumped out from their hiding spots, laughing as they surprised the men. Everyone smiled, waiting for the youngest to emerge and take his turn. Minutes ticked by. The laughter faded. The wind rustled the high grass. William Martin stood up, expecting to see his son peering out from behind the leaves. He walked over to the bush. Dennis was not there. William called his name, his voice echoing lightly against the tree line. There was no answer. He walked past the edge of the clearing, looking down into the dense tree cover. The forest was perfectly still. There was no sound of a struggle, no snapping of twigs, no rustling of branches, and no footsteps retreating into the brush. Dennis Martin had vanished in the span of perhaps 3 minutes, stepping out of the visible world and into the shadows. The immediate panic of a parent set in, followed rapidly by an organized search. Park rangers were notified, and within hours, the trails were swarming with volunteers. But the mountains were already conspiring against them. That evening, a torrential downpour slammed into the Smokies. 3 inches of freezing rain washed over the ridges in a matter of hours, erasing any footprints, destroying scent trails, and turning these steep, muddy ravines into treacherous death traps. The temperature plummeted. While the search desperately expanded at Spence Field, a separate, deeply unsettling incident was unfolding a few miles away near Rowan's Creek. Harold Key and his family had been hiking in the area that same afternoon. Around the exact time Dennis vanished, the Key family was startled by a sound that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. It was not the bark of a coyote or the growl of a black bear. Harold later described it to investigators as a sickening scream. It was a horrific, ragged wail that sounded undeniably human, yet carried a pitch of pure, primal terror. Harold looked up toward the ridge where the scream had originated. Through the gaps in the heavy timber, he saw movement. A figure was moving rapidly across the uneven, treacherous terrain. It was massive, moving with a fluid, terrifying speed that no normal hiker could achieve in that brush. Harold noted that the figure appeared entirely unkempt, covered in dark, matted hair or dark, ragged clothing. Most chilling of all, the massive figure was carrying something draped over its thick shoulder as it ran. It crested the ridge and disappeared into the deepest part of the forest, moving with the silent, predatory grace of something that belonged in the wild. When Harold Key reported this to the authorities, his account touched upon a dark, unspoken vein of Appalachian lore. For generations, whispers had circulated through the isolated mountain communities about feral humans. These were not mere hermits, but generations of outcasts who had retreated into the deepest, unmapped cave systems of the Smokies centuries ago. The legends spoke of devolved, territorial clans who hunted the deep woods, surviving entirely off the grid, stripped of their humanity. They were the shadows at the edge of the firelight, the watchers in the laurel hills. They did not hunt for sport. They took what wandered too close to their domain. The search for Dennis Martin quickly escalated into the largest in the history of the national park. But as days turned into a week, the nature of the operation shifted in a way that deeply unnerved the local volunteers. The United States Army Special Forces, the legendary Green Berets, arrived in the mountains. This was an unprecedented response for a missing child case. They arrived in full combat gear, heavily armed with military-grade weaponry. The Green Berets did not integrate with the park rangers or the civilian search parties. They established their own base camps, set up closed perimeters, and operated in complete secrecy. Volunteers noted that the soldiers were not walking the trails looking for a boy, they were systematically sweeping the most remote, treacherous ravines, moving in tactical formations with their weapons drawn. A chilling realization began to spread through the search camps. You do not send heavily armed commandos into a national forest to find a 6-year-old boy. You send them to hunt whatever took him. Despite the overwhelming manpower, not a single trace of Dennis Martin was ever found. Not a shoe, not a fragment of bone, and not a single shred of his bright red shirt. The official investigation eventually concluded, attributing his disappearance to exposure or perhaps an animal attack, though no evidence supported either theory. The Federal Bureau of Investigation heavily downplayed Harold Key's testimony, officially classifying his sighting as a hunter or a bear, entirely ignoring his description of the sickening scream and the dark figure carrying a burden. The case was quietly closed, but the mountains do not forget. The silence in the deep ravines around Spence Field still feels heavier than in other parts of the park. The feral shadow that Harold Key saw was never identified, and the true objective of the Green Berets remains locked in military archives. The terrifying reality remains that a young boy stepped behind a bush and was silently, instantly absorbed by the ancient forest. It leaves those who walk the remote trails of the Smokies to wonder, as they look into the impenetrable darkness of the Laurel Hells, if something wild and unseen is looking back. The Pogo Clown's Crawlspace. The suburbs of Chicago in the 1970s were a portrait of American stability. Neatly paved streets, freshly painted fences, and the quiet assurance that hard work yielded a comfortable life. On Somerdale Avenue in Des Plaines, this ideal was embodied by a successful contractor. He was a precinct captain, a charismatic neighbor who threw lavish summer barbecues, and a man who volunteered his weekends to entertain sick children dressed as Pogo the Clown. But beneath the veneer of civic duty and neighborly warmth, beneath the very floorboards of his sprawling brick ranch house, a suffocating darkness was taking root. It did not begin with a sight or a sound. It began with a smell. At first, the odor was subtle. It was a heavy, damp presence that seemed to cling to the lower edges of the rooms. The contractor's wife would walk through her kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon and catch a faint, sickeningly sweet waft drifting up from the heating vents. It did not smell like common household garbage. It was an oily, thick scent, reminiscent of spoiled meat left too long in the sun, mixed with the chalky, bitter chemical tang of quicklime. It was the kind of smell that coats the back of the throat and settles deep in the lungs. When she questioned him, John Wayne Gacy remained perfectly calm. He did not flinch or grow defensive. With the smooth, reassuring cadence of a seasoned salesman, he offered logical explanations. The house was built on a high water table, he told her. It was simply moisture building up in the dark, unventilated earth of the crawlspace. Or perhaps, he suggested with a casual shrug, a stray cat or a rat had crawled under the foundation during a cold snap and died. To fix it, he hauled dozens of bags of powdered lime into the house, dragging them down the hallway to the small access hatch in the floor. The access hatch was a small, unassuming square of wood that led down into a claustrophobic nightmare. The crawlspace was not a basement. It was a tight, oppressive gap between the floor joists and the raw earth, offering only a few feet of clearance. A man could not stand down there. He had to crouch, dragging himself through the cold, damp mud on his hands and knees. In the absolute darkness of that cramped void, the air was entirely still, thick with the heat of decomposition. Over the years, Gacy descended into this lightless pocket of earth again and again, armed with a short-handled shovel. He carved shallow trenches into the soil, forcing limp, lifeless forms into spaces too small to hold them, folding limbs to make them fit, and burying them under a thick snowfall of corrosive lime. Above ground, the charade of normalcy continued, creating a grotesque juxtaposition that defied comprehension. In the height of summer, usually around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Gacy would host his legendary backyard barbecues. Hundreds of guests would arrive. There were local politicians, distinguished police officers, and successful business owners, all mingling under the warm afternoon sun. They drank cold beer, played horseshoes on the lawn, and laughed at Gacy's loud, boisterous jokes. Is less than hason. Zero hash is greater than. Gacy would stand at the large outdoor grill wearing an apron, skillfully flipping burgers and steaks. The rich, savory smoke of cooking meat would billow across the yard, masking the faint, persistent odor rising from the ground below. As the guests stood on the patio, making small talk and enjoying the suburban twilight, they were completely oblivious. They were standing on a graveyard. Just inches below the soles of their expensive shoes, separated only by a thin layer of topsoil and concrete, lay the rotting remains of young men. 29 bodies were packed into the earth beneath the property, slowly dissolving into the mud while the party carried on above them. But as the years passed, the crawl space grew crowded. The earth could no longer absorb the volume of the dead. By 1977, the sickening sweetness in the house became impossible to ignore. In the dead of winter, when the bitter Illinois wind forced the family to close all the windows and turn on the furnace, the horror amplified. The heating system acted as an exhaust pipe for the tomb below. The warm air pushed the concentrated, putrid stench of mass decay up through the floor registers, filling the bedrooms, the living room, and the kitchen with the undeniable smell of death. The scent permeated the furniture. It settled into the fabric of the curtains and the fibers of the carpets. The wife burned candles constantly, leaving windows cracked open despite the freezing temperatures, desperate to scrub the foulness from her home. Gacy brought in industrial deodorizers and fans, complaining loudly about the poor drainage system. He continued to pour hundreds of pounds of lime down the hatch. He maintained his mask of irritation, acting as the frustrated homeowner dealing with a stubborn structural issue. He would put on his clown makeup, paint a wide red smile over his face, and head out to parties, leaving his family to breathe in the exhalations of his victims. The claustrophobia of the house became psychological as well as physical. The air was thick, suffocating, and heavy with an unspoken dread. Neighbors began to notice the strange, pungent odor wafting from the property when the wind blew in a certain direction. They, too, accepted the story of the broken sump pump and the damp earth. No one wanted to believe that the cheerful man who fixed their sidewalks and hosted their block parties was capable of anything sinister. The human mind naturally rejects the unimaginable, preferring to believe in dead rats rather than murdered boys. The illusion finally collapsed in the freezing final days of 1978. Investigators, looking into the disappearance of a local teenager, executed a search warrant on the house at 8213 Summerdale. When a detective stood in the living room, feeling the warm air blow from a heating vent, the smell hit him. It was a scent no seasoned officer could mistake for a dead animal or a moisture problem. It was the distinct, unmistakable odor of human putrefaction. They pulled up the access panel. A technician lowered himself into the dark, incredibly tight space beneath the house. The heat down there was unnatural, generated by the chemical reaction of the lime and the biological process of dozens of bodies breaking down in the soil. As the technician swept away a thin layer of dirt and white powder, his trowel struck something hard. It was not a pipe, and it was not a stone. It was a human femur. What followed was a slow, agonizing excavation. The crawl space was so heavily packed with remains that investigators struggled to tell where one trench ended and another began. The earth was saturated. The claustrophobia of the site meant officers had to work in agonizingly cramped positions, breathing through heavy masks, carefully removing the victims one by one from the dark mud. They uncovered 29 bodies in that tight, airless void beneath the floorboards, a silent congregation trapped in the dark while the world walked above them. The house was eventually demolished, erased from the manicured landscape of Summerdale Avenue. The lot was left vacant, a patch of empty grass standing in stark contrast to the identical homes surrounding it. But the memory of that suffocating house remains a permanent scar on the neighborhood. For those who lived there, who attended the parties, and who breathed the air in that living room, the horror lingers. It is the realization of how thin the floorboards truly are, and how easily a monster can hide his darkness behind a painted smile and a neighborly wave, burying his secrets in the shallow earth while the rest of the world turns a blind eye. The Byron Street Disturbance. The town of Runcorn, situated on the southern bank of the River Mersey in the county of Cheshire, was a place defined by industry and routine in the early 1950s. It was a landscape of red brick terraced housing, chemical works, and the lingering austerity of the post-war era. The community was tight-knit, grounded in the practical realities of labor and domestic life, with little patience for flights of fancy or superstitious hysteria. In August of 1952, this pragmatic atmosphere was ruptured by a series of events centered on a small, unremarkable row house at 1 Byron Street. The incidents that occurred within the walls of this residence were witnessed not only by the inhabitants, but by neighbors, journalists, and, most significantly, serving officers of the Cheshire Constabulary. The subsequent investigation produced a set of police records that remain among the most puzzling in the history of British domestic disturbances, detailing physical phenomena that defied the laws of mechanics and ballistics. The case was never criminally prosecuted, as no human perpetrator could be identified, and the events eventually ceased as abruptly as they had begun, leaving a residue of unanswered questions that lingers in the archival record. The residence at 1 Byron Street was occupied by the Jones family. The household consisted of 68-year-old John Jones, a man recently widowed, his son Samuel, Samuel's wife Eileen, and their 2 young grandsons. The emotional climate of the home had been somber in the weeks leading up to the disturbances. John Jones was grieving the loss of his wife, who had passed away earlier that year. In the cramped conditions typical of the era, the family members lived in close quarters, with tensions and grief sharing the same limited air. The patriarch, John, occupied a bedroom on the upper floor, a room that would soon become the focal point of the anomaly. The initial signs of unrest were subtle, manifesting as auditory irritants rather than visual terrors. In mid-August, the family began to report sounds that had no logical source. There were scratchings within the wall cavities, the sound of heavy thuds on the floorboards above when the upstairs rooms were known to be empty, and the distinct, unnerving noise of drawers being opened and closed violently. At first, the Jones family attributed these noises to the settling of the house or perhaps the intrusion of vermin, a common enough occurrence in the terraced streets near the river. Samuel Jones, a practical man, inspected the floorboards and the attic spaces but found no evidence of structural shifting or animal infestation. The plumbing was checked, the windows were secured, and the neighbors were consulted to see if the sounds were traveling through the party walls. No explanation was forthcoming. The noises escalated rapidly from ambiguous creaks to deliberate, rhythmic banging that seemed to respond to the presence of the family members. It was not until the events of the weekend of August 17th that the phenomena transitioned from auditory to kinetic, precipitating a crisis that would force the family to seek external assistance. The escalation began in the bedroom of John Jones. The room was sparsely furnished, dominated by a heavy chest of drawers and a bed. On the evening in question, the family was downstairs when a tremendous crash shook the ceiling plaster. Rushing upstairs, they found the bedroom in disarray. The heavy furniture, items that required significant effort for a grown man to lift, had been displaced. This was the beginning of a siege that would last for weeks. Over the next few days, the activity intensified. Objects began to move with a visible trajectory that witnesses described as unnatural. It was not merely that things fell, it was that they flew. Books, clock faces, and small ornaments were reported to lift from surfaces and travel across the room, often navigating around obstacles before striking the walls or floor. Terrified and exhausted, the family turned to the only authority available to them, the local police. The involvement of the Cheshire Constabulary is what distinguishes the Runcorn case from countless other anecdotal hauntings. Police officers are trained observers, required to record facts, times, and physical evidence in official notebooks. They are professionally predisposed to skepticism and are tasked with finding human perpetrators for disruptive behavior. When Constable T.A. Edwards arrived at the property, he did so with the expectation of finding a practical joke, a domestic dispute, or a structural fault. What he encountered instead would become part of the official police log. Edwards, along with other officers who would visit the property over the ensuing weeks, found himself acting not as an investigator of crime, but as a witness to the impossible. During one of the initial vigils held by the police, the officers positioned themselves in the bedroom, ensuring that no family members were present in the room and that the space was sealed from external interference. The room was inspected for wires, hidden mechanisms, or drafts. It was a still, humid night. According to the reports filed later, the officers witnessed the heavy chest of drawers, which was devoid of wheels or casters, lift one side from the floor and rotate. There was no one near the object. The movement was accompanied by a vibration that could be felt through the floorboards. Constable Edwards checked the perimeter again, looking for any sign of a hoax, but the room was secure. The movement of the furniture was not the result of a sudden jolt or explosion. It was described as a deliberate, controlled force application. As the news of the disturbances spread, the environment around Byron Street transformed. The private terror of the Jones family became a public spectacle. Crowds began to gather at the ends of the street, drawn by rumors of the Runcorn poltergeist. The term poltergeist, meaning noisy ghost, was used liberally by the press, although the police and the family avoided such labels, preferring to describe the events simply as disturbances. The presence of the crowd added a layer of chaos to the investigation. Officers now had to manage traffic and disperse onlookers while simultaneously trying to document the inexplicable events occurring inside Number 1. The psychological strain on the family was immense. Eileen Jones, in particular, was reported to be near the point of collapse, terrified for the safety of her children and unable to sleep due to the constant activity in the house. The physical phenomena continued to evolve in complexity. It was not just heavy furniture that moved, smaller objects displayed a disturbing dexterity. A family Bible was reported to have been thrown across the room by an unseen hand. A table lamp was observed to rock violently before toppling over, despite the absence of any vibration in the floor. One of the most chilling reports involved a shapeless, dark shadow seen by Samuel Jones on the landing, a visual manifestation that marked a departure from the purely kinetic activity. The police, struggling to maintain order and rationality, brought in reinforcements. A thorough search of the house was conducted, including the lifting of floorboards and the inspection of the roof space. The search revealed nothing out of the ordinary. No hidden accomplices, no trickery, no geological faults. The house was simply a brick box, behaving in a way that physics dictated it should not. The local newspaper, the Times Runcorn Weekly News Asterisk, began to chronicle the events, treating the story with a degree of seriousness that reflected the testimony of the police officers. The reports from late August detail an incident where a clock, securely fastened to the wall, was ripped from its mountings and thrown to the floor while officers were present in the house. The force required to detach the clock was significant, yet no person was within reach of the object. The trajectory of the clock was noted to be flat and forceful, inconsistent with a simple fall due to gravity or a loose screw. It was as if the object had been swatted by an invisible limb. The police logs from this period reflect a growing sense of frustration and unease among the officers. They were trained to arrest criminals, not to wrestle with the unseen. In an attempt to find a solution, the family and their neighbors tried various remedies. Prayers were said and the house was blessed, but the activity seemed indifferent to religious intervention. If anything, the introduction of religious iconography seemed to provoke a more violent response. Objects associated with faith were often the first to be targeted. The atmosphere in the house was described as heavy, with a palpable drop in temperature often preceding the physical outbursts. This cold spot phenomenon, while a cliché in fiction, was reported as a genuine sensory experience by the officers who noted a sudden chill in the air even on warm summer nights. The cold was localized, often confined to the bedroom or the landing, and would dissipate as soon as the activity ceased. The turning point in the public perception of the case came when the phenomenon began to interact with the police directly. During a night watch, an officer reported being struck by a flying object. The object, a small tin, hit the officer with force but did not cause serious injury. It was the intent behind the action that was disturbing. The entity, or force, appeared to be aware of the observers and capable of targeting them. This aggression escalated the situation from a curiosity to a threat. The police hierarchy was in a difficult position. They could not arrest a ghost, nor could they abandon a family clearly in distress. They continued their vigils, recording the events with a meticulousness that now serves as the primary validation of the case. Their records state clearly that objects moved of their own accord, that noises originated from empty spaces, and that the family was not responsible for the chaos. One particular night stands out in the accumulated testimonies. It was a weekend in late August when the activity reached a fever pitch. The heavy dressing table in John Jones's room began to dance. Witnesses described the piece of furniture lifting and dropping repeatedly, creating a rhythmic pounding that could be heard in the street outside. The police, standing in the doorway, shone their torches on the object. They saw it rise several inches into the air, hover momentarily, and then crash down. The drawers rattled violently, and the mirror attached to the unit shook but did not break. The officers checked for wires or strings, passing their hands around the object while it was in motion. There was nothing. The sheer energy required to lift such a weight repeatedly was immense, yet the source of that energy remained undetectable. The investigation attracted the attention of casual researchers and spiritualists, though the serious parapsychological organizations of the time were slower to mobilize than they would be in later decades. The phenomena at Byron Street were largely managed by the local community and the constabulary. This isolation meant that the case was not contaminated by the presence of media-savvy ghost hunters or television crews. The documentation remains raw and immediate, filtering through the lens of police procedure rather than entertainment. The officers' accounts are devoid of sensationalism. They use the language of the beat cop, factual, descriptive, and utterly baffled. They report unauthorized movements and displaced items rather than demons or spirits, which lends the accounts a terrifying credibility. As September approached, the nature of the disturbances began to change. The violence lessened, replaced by a sullen, brooding atmosphere. The banging continued, but with less frequency. The family, exhausted and fraying at the edges, began to discuss leaving the house. The neighbors, too, were weary of the constant crowds and the disruption to their quiet street. The spectacle had run its course, and the adrenaline of the initial weeks was replaced by a grim endurance. It was during this waning phase that the final significant event occurred. A police officer, sitting alone in the kitchen, reported hearing a voice. It was not a distinct sentence, but a guttural, unintelligible vocalization that seemed to emanate from the corner of the room. He described it as sounding like a breathless rasp. No one else was in the kitchen. This auditory manifestation was the only time a voice was reported, adding a layer of intelligence or sentience to what had previously been a display of brute force. The cessation of the Runcorn disturbances was as mysterious as their onset. By the middle of September 1952, the activity simply stopped. There was no exorcism, no dramatic climax, and no discovery of a hoax. The house fell silent, the heavy furniture remained stationary, the flying objects stayed on their shelves. The police withdrew their vigils, filing their final reports with no conclusion as to the cause of the disorder. The crowds dispersed, and Byron Street returned to its mundane existence. The Jones family remained in the house for a time, wary and scarred by the experience, but the phenomena did not return. The abrupt ending is common in poltergeist cases, often leaving victims and researchers without closure or explanation. The aftermath of the Byron Street case left a legacy of confusion in the local area. The police officers involved rarely spoke of the events in later years, perhaps fearing ridicule or professional repercussions. However, the written records survived. In the archives of the Cheshire Constabulary and the local press, the details of the Runcorn poltergeist are preserved. They tell of a time when the rational world of 1950s England collided with the irrational, and the authorities of the state were forced to document the impossible. The case was never solved. No trickery was ever exposed. The family was never found to be complicit. The events happened, were observed, were recorded, and then ceased. What makes the Runcorn case particularly unsettling is the mundane nature of the setting. This was not a Gothic mansion or a lonely farmhouse. It was a terraced house in a crowded industrial town. The walls were thin, the neighbors were close, the privacy required for an elaborate hoax was simply not available. The presence of the police, acting as independent verifiers, removes the possibility of mass hysteria or family fabrication. These were men who dealt with drunkards, thieves, and domestic abusers. They were not prone to flights of fancy. When they wrote that a clock flew across a room, they did so because they saw a clock fly across a room. The cognitive dissonance experienced by these officers is palpable in their reports, a struggle to reconcile their training with their sensory experience. The theories surrounding the case at the time focused heavily on the energy of the household. Researchers of the era often looked to the presence of adolescence or emotional trauma as a catalyst for poltergeist activity. The grief of John Jones, mourning his late wife, was seen by some as a potential trigger, a projection of psychic pain that manifested as kinetic energy. Others looked to the grandsons, suggesting that the repressed energy of youth in a strict, crowded household was erupting in physical outbursts. However, these were merely hypotheses. No mechanism has ever been established that explains how grief or puberty can cause a 400-pound dressing table to levitate. The gap between the psychological theory and the physical reality remains unbridged. Retrospective analysis of the Byron Street disturbance often highlights the specificity of the phenomena. The objects that moved were domestic drawers, clocks, Bibles, lamps. It was an assault on the domestic sphere, a disruption of the order that the Jones family tried to maintain. The violence was directed at the home itself, turning the sanctuary of the bedroom into a zone of danger. The poltergeist did not just make noise, it dismantled the room, it stripped the bed, overturned the furniture, and threw the symbols of stability, the clock and the Bible, into the air. It was a localized rebellion against the physical order of the house. In the years that followed, the story of one Byron Street faded from the national consciousness, overshadowed by more sensational cases like Enfield or the Borley Rectory. However, among researchers of anomalous phenomena, Runcorn holds a special place due to the quality of the testimony. It serves as a reminder that high strangeness is not confined to folklore or history. It can occur in the presence of the law under the glare of a torch in a council house in Cheshire. The silence that followed the events of 1952 has never been fully broken. The house still stands, the street remains, but the force that briefly occupied number 1 has gone. The reconstruction of the events relies heavily on the timeline established by the police visits. On August 17th, the first report was filed. On August 19th, the dresser moved. On August 22nd, the media arrived. By September 10th, the activity was waning. This condensed timeline of less than a month contained a lifetime of trauma for the residents. The intensity of the experience was such that the family's recollection of those weeks became blurred, a montage of fear and sleeplessness. It was the police logs that provided the structure, anchoring the nightmare in dates and times. Without the intervention of the constabulary, the story might have been dismissed as neighborhood gossip. With it, it becomes a matter of record. One detail that is often overlooked in summaries of the case is the behavior of the family dog. Reports mention that the animal would refuse to enter the bedroom of John Jones, growling at the empty air and cowering in the corner of the landing. Animals are frequently cited as early warning systems in such cases, and the reaction of the Joneses' dog suggests that the phenomena had a sensory component that was perceptible to non-humans before it became visible to the people. The dog's terror added to the atmosphere of dread, reinforcing the feeling that an intruder was present in the house, even if that intruder had no body. The final aspect of the Runcorn case that ensures its endurance is the lack of a moral or narrative conclusion. In fiction, the ghost is laid to rest, the crime is solved, or the family flees. In Runcorn, none of this happened. The family stayed. The ghost just stopped. There was no message delivered, no bones found in the cellar, no curse lifted. The randomness of the event is its most disturbing feature. It implies that the laws of physics can be suspended arbitrarily, without cause or warning, and then reinstated just as easily. It suggests a universe that is more permeable and less stable than we are comfortable admitting. The residents of Byron Street went back to work, the police went back to catching thieves, and the file was closed, but the anomaly remained a fact. To this day, the Byron Street disturbance is cited in parapsychological literature as a perfect poltergeist case. Short duration, high intensity, credible witnesses, and zero explanation. It stands as a testament to the limitations of our understanding of the physical world. The officers who stood in that bedroom and watched a dresser float did not believe in ghosts, but they had to believe their eyes. They wrote it down, signed their names, and filed the report. And in that act of bureaucratic witnessing, they preserved a moment where reality blinked. The story of the Runcorn poltergeist is not a story of a haunted house. It is a story of a haunted reality, a brief window into a world where the impossible becomes the inevitable. The missing child was found miles away, barefoot and unharmed. On a cold Saturday in late October 2019, dispatch logs show a child vanished near Flagstaff, Arizona. His name was Ethan Ross, age 7, and he hiked with his mother, who worked as a hospice nurse. Searchers expected hypothermia or injury because the wind dropped fast and the ground turned slick soon after dusk. State records say he was found at dawn, barefoot and calm, about 7 miles from the trailhead in Coconino County. Investigators never confirmed how he traveled that distance, and records conflict about what he told the first deputy. Marissa Ross was 34 and newly assigned in the region, so she treated the hike like a simple reset after overtime shifts. They started from a popular access point in the Kaibab National Forest, where trail signs are clear and cell service fades quickly. According to archive notes, Ethan walked ahead in bursts, then circled back when he heard her call his name. At 4:38 p.m., a record shows Marissa called 911, saying he slipped behind a low ridge and never returned. Dispatch logs report moderate traffic on the trail, yet no one could agree on the last confirmed sighting. Deputy Luis Ortega was 41 and on patrol near the city, and he reached the staging area within 20 minutes. He told investigators he saw Marissa's hands shaking, and he noted wind gusts that made voices carry in strange directions. County file from 2009 describes a similar confusion during a rescue where echoes misled callers in tight drainages. Ortega ordered a perimeter on the nearest service roads because children sometimes follow gentle grades until they meet a barrier. Some locals claimed they saw a small figure near the trees, but investigators never confirmed those reports later. Search and rescue teams arrived with thermal cameras, and they began a grid along the trail and adjacent washes. State records say the temperature fell into the low 30s, and thin sleet started over the higher slopes after midnight. Marissa stayed with a liaison officer, and she repeated the same timeline while dispatch logs recorded each update. Reports reportedly differed on Ethan's clothing, though most notes say he wore a light jacket and sneakers alone. Investigators later wrote that inconsistent descriptions slowed the first canine track because handlers chose the wrong scent item. Ortega's report says Ethan's sneakers were found near a sandstone outcrop placed side by side with the laces still tied. That detail became the center of later rumors, yet the county file shows no evidence of foul play at the scene. Deputies photographed shallow scuffs in gritty soil, but archived notes say the marks were too faint for a reliable direction. Marissa insisted she never removed his shoes, and she told state investigators she would have noticed any struggle. Some searchers reportedly thought the placement looked deliberate, but their impressions were never entered as formal findings officially. Through the night, radios logged short bursts of uncertain audio because the canyon walls bounced signals and masked distance. Teams used flares on ridgelines to maintain orientation, and helicopters stayed grounded due to low cloud and freezing precipitation. Ortega wrote that Marissa kept asking about footprints, and he reminded her that wind can erase prints within minutes. County staff pulled archived maps and old fire roads, and they highlighted routes that a child could follow without realizing it. The working theory in the dispatch logs was simple wandering, yet records conflict about how fast a 7-year-old could move. At 2:11 a.m., dispatch logs show a truck driver called from a road southeast of town, reporting a small person. The driver said the child was moving barefoot and steady, and he seemed more annoyed than frightened under the headlights. Ortega responded with another unit, but state records say the caller could not relocate the spot after turning around. Investigators later noted that darkness and featureless pines make landmarks unreliable, especially for people unfamiliar with the plateau. Some locals claimed the call was mistaken identity, though county records list no other missing children that night. Just before sunrise, a ranch hand reported a boy near a stock tank outside the main search grid, according to state records. Ortega arrived and found Ethan sitting on packed dirt, hands in his pockets, staring at the brightening line of the horizon. The deputy noted cracked feet and minor abrasions, with no swelling and no bleeding and no sign of severe cold exposure. Ethan reportedly asked for water and said he wanted to go back, yet he could not describe how he got there. Archived notes say he spoke in short sentences, and he did not mention any adults or vehicles or animals. Paramedics checked Ethan's core temperature, and dispatch logs show it was low, but not dangerously low for the conditions. His jacket was damp and stained with pine litter, and his knees had flecks of mud consistent with kneeling or crawling. State investigators asked about pain, and he said his feet hurt, yet he walked unaided to the ambulance after a brief rest. Marissa reached the scene minutes later, and Ortega wrote that she collapsed when she saw him standing on his own. The official record lists the outcome as found alive, while several archived notes include the phrase unexpectedly unharmed. In interviews, Ethan said he followed a light-colored rock, then a straight line of trees, then he was tired. Investigators never confirmed those landmarks because the area has many similar outcrops and replanting rows from old forestry work. County File from 2009 warns that child narratives often compress time, especially after stress and interrupted sleep. Ortega asked whether anyone spoke to him overnight, and Ethan said no, though he added that he heard people yelling. Records conflict on whether he described a road, since one note says he mentioned cars and another says he feared coyotes. Marissa's statement remained consistent in the county file, and she said she never left the trail more than a few steps. She admitted she checked her phone twice, and she wondered if that silence was long enough for him to drift away. Investigators documented her work schedule, noting consecutive night shifts and possible fatigue, but they did not assign blame. Dispatch logs show she offered her own shoes for scent, then realized they carried hospital disinfectant and could confuse dogs. Some locals claimed negligence, yet state records emphasized the trail's deceptive terrain and fast-moving weather patterns overnight. An evidence technician measured the distance from the shoe location to the recovery site, and the estimate was just over 7 miles. Investigators never confirmed a direct path because canine tracks broke repeatedly and weather wiped subtle traces before dawn. County File from 2009 notes that search grids often miss narrow corridors, especially when resources focus near last-seen points. Still, the mileage became the headline number, and it shaped how the public interpreted every later detail online. It also pressured investigators to explain movement, even when the record only supported gaps and competing guesses. Ortega considered whether a vehicle picked Ethan up, yet dispatch logs contain no confirmed plate sightings and no traffic stops related. State records say a ranger checked trail cameras, but many units were offline due to battery drain from the cold snap. Archive notes mention a white pickup reported near the access point, though the report came secondhand and lacked a timestamp. Investigators never confirmed the pickup's relevance, and they did not list it as a suspect lead in the final summary. Some locals claimed a stranger helped him, but county staff recorded no verified witness who spoke directly to Ethan. The barefoot detail raised questions, because the sneakers were clean enough to suggest they were removed on relatively soft ground. Ortega wrote that the soles showed minimal wear and the laces were tied in the way Marissa said she tied them. Investigators asked whether Ethan could undo tight laces, and Marissa said he could, though he often left knots loose. State records note the outcrop had smooth ledges where a child might sit, pull its shoes, and swing legs in boredom. Records conflict on the timing, since one log suggests the shoes appeared after the first sweep and another suggests they were missed. During the following week, officials compiled statements and weather data, and they filed them under Coconino County Case Management. Archived notes show the team reviewed topography for hidden drainages, because children sometimes follow water sounds even in dry season. Ortega checked hospitals and shelters, though that step was redundant once Ethan was recovered, and it served as documentation. State records show a brief inquiry into possible abuse, standard for any missing child case, and it was closed without action. Some locals claimed a cover-up, yet the county file reads like ordinary bureaucracy, with corrections and crossed-out estimates. One overlooked factor was sound, because the plateau's slopes can reflect voices and make a caller seem closer than reality. County file from 2009 includes a training memo about acoustic mirages, and it warns deputies against trusting direction alone. Marissa told investigators she heard Ethan answer once, then nothing, and she kept turning toward the wrong drainage as she called. Ortega later said that detail matched what he saw, because her footsteps formed a small loop pattern around the ridge base. Investigators never confirmed the shouted reply, yet they did not dismiss it, because multiple searches reported similar false returns. Ethan's medical exam showed mild dehydration and superficial scratches, and nothing consistent with falls from height or extended exposure. Doctors reportedly found no signs of sedation, though the county file notes that only limited toxicology was ordered. Marissa said he slept for 12 hours afterward, then woke hungry and quiet, and he refused to talk about the night. Ortega documented that behavior as common because children often protect themselves by minimizing confusing memories afterward at home. Records conflict on whether he later described a barking dog, since a council report mentions it and the county file does not. Investigators mapped likely drift routes, and they focused on gentle slopes that guide feet downhill without obvious turns. Kaibab soils can crust overnight, so a small track may look sharp at dawn, then vanish after a few hours of sun. Ortega noted that Ethan's feet held tiny cinders, suggesting he crossed a burned patch from an older prescribed fire unit. State records list that unit near the recovery area, yet the boundary lines were approximate and partly outdated. Some locals claimed the cinders proved he walked the whole way, but investigators never confirmed the timing of that contact. In the months after, local papers ran competing timelines, and some articles mixed radio chatter with later interviews. State records show officials corrected one story that placed Ethan on a different trail, and the editor issued a brief update. Ortega stopped giving interviews, and he cited an open records review, though the case was technically closed as a recovery. Some locals claimed the silence proved wrongdoing, but county staff said it was routine caution after public misquotations. The county file includes multiple requests for copies, and several pages were marked as incomplete drafts. Marissa moved back to Phoenix within a year, according to state employment records, and she requested a transfer away from field calls. Friends reportedly said she could not tolerate hiking trails, and she avoided the smell of wet pine after that night. Ortega remained in the county system, and he trained new deputies on missing person protocols and documentation habits. County file from 2009 was attached to the training packet, as a reminder that old cases shape new assumptions. Investigators never confirmed any single mechanism for Ethan's travel, so the file became a lesson in uncertainty rather than closure. When researchers later requested the records, the county released redacted pages, and several timestamps were blurred for privacy. Those redactions fueled more speculation because readers tried to reconstruct routes from partial data and secondhand retellings. Archived notes show that one early radio log was transcribed twice, and the two versions differ by several minutes. Officials said the discrepancy came from manual entry during high-traffic periods, and it was not considered significant. Even so, records conflict on when the shoe photo was taken, and that small gap became a major talking point. Several hikers who joined the search later said they heard a child crying far downhill, yet none could triangulate the sound. Ortega wrote that volunteer impressions were valuable, but they were not reliable evidence without corroboration or physical markers. Dispatch logs list 3 false leads that night, including a lost dog report and a backpack left beside a restroom wall. State records show that each lead drew resources for at least 30 minutes, reducing coverage in other sections of forest. Some locals claimed those diversions were intentional, but investigators never confirmed any link between the misreports and Ethan. After review, the county classified the incident as a short-term disappearance with atypical travel distance, reportedly uncommon but not unique. County file from 2009 lists 3 prior cases in northern Arizona, where children were found far from expected corridors. Those cases include one boy found near a ranch gate and another located beside a creek, both alive and largely uninjured. Investigators never confirmed common patterns beyond stamina and luck, because each terrain and weather profile differed dramatically. The Ross file cites those precedents, yet it also notes that Ethan's barefoot condition remains unexplained within the available record. At a community meeting in Flagstaff, officials emphasized prevention, and they advised parents to use whistles and bright layers. Marissa did not attend, and county notes say she asked for privacy and declined media contact after the hospital visit. Ortega presented dispatch log excerpts, and he stressed that early precise descriptions help dogs and reduce wasted sweeps. State records show the county later added trailhead signage about sudden weather because that night surprised even locals. The meeting ended without a definitive answer, and the case remained a reminder that outcomes can be good without being understood. Years later, some locals still tell the story as proof of something dark in the forest, but the official language stays careful. State records describe it as unresolved movement with positive recovery, and they avoid conclusions that exceed the documented facts. Marissa never filed a lawsuit, and she did not publicly accuse anyone, which limited the paper trail to county and state records. Ortega's final note says missing child cases distort time and distance and memory, then they leave everyone wanting a clean map. The file ends with a single line, reportedly typed during an audit, saying the child was found miles away, barefoot and unharmed. The Midnight Choir of Waverly Hills. On a high wooded ridge in southwestern Louisville, Kentucky, a decaying Gothic monolith bleeds into the night sky. Waverly Hills Sanatorium stands as a sprawling, bat-winged fortress of dark brick and shattered glass. The structure is massive, dominating the landscape with a heavy, oppressive stillness. It is a place where time ceased to move decades ago, yet the physical residue of immense human suffering never truly evaporated from its halls. The wind that pulls through the empty window frames does not merely whistle, it wheezes, dragging across the cracked plaster like breath through a ruined trachea. To understand the atmosphere of Waverly Hills is to understand the White Plague. In the early 20th century, tuberculosis was a death sentence that arrived as a slow, suffocating thief. By 1926, the massive 5-story sanatorium was opened to accommodate the overwhelming tide of the afflicted. It was designed as an island of quarantine, a place where the sick were sent to either recover through experimental fresh air therapies or, far more often, to die in isolation. Patients were subjected to brutal treatments, ribs were surgically removed to collapse infected lungs, and heavy sandbags were placed on chests. The sheer volume of mortality was staggering. It is estimated that up to 60,000 souls took their final, agonizing breaths within these walls. The bodies became so numerous that a motorized cable system was installed in a concrete tunnel stretching 400 feet down the hill. This became known as the body chute, a grim artery designed to transport the dead away quietly, out of sight of the living whose morale was already fracturing. Today, the building is a hollow shell, stripped of its medical equipment and abandoned to the elements. Yet, those who are tasked with walking its long, cavernous corridors at night understand that Waverly Hills is not empty. It is saturated. The caretakers and night guards who patrol the sprawling wards do not speak of traditional hauntings. They do not report transparent figures in period clothing. Instead, they describe a terrifying environmental playback, a phenomenon where the building itself seems to regurgitate the sensory horrors of its past. The auditory terror usually begins deep in the night, often reported around 2:30 a.m., when the ambient noise of the surrounding city has completely faded. A lone guard walking the central corridor of the fourth floor will first notice a severe drop in air pressure. The atmosphere grows heavy, thick with a metallic scent that closely resembles old dried copper. It is the distinct, unmistakable smell of blood. The temperature plummets rapidly, mimicking the cold, damp sweat of a breaking fever. Then, the silence is broken by a single, wet sound. It starts as a low, guttural click at the far end of the pitch-black hallway, a sharp intake of air followed by a wet, heavy cough. The sound is highly localized, echoing off the peeling lead paint and the chipped terrazzo floors. It sounds exactly like a human being struggling to clear a massive obstruction from their throat. Before the mind can rationalize the sound as a trick of the wind or settling pipes, a second cough joins in from an adjacent empty room. Then a third, emanating from the shadows directly behind the listener. Within moments, the isolated sounds cascade into a horrific symphony. It is a phenomenon known among the night staff as the midnight choir. Dozens, then hundreds of invisible throats begin to spasm simultaneously. It is the terrible, unmistakable sound of the death rattle, the final stage of respiratory failure, where fluid pools in the lungs and the failing throat loses its ability to swallow. The acoustics of the long, tiled corridors amplify the noise until it becomes a deafening roar. It is the sound of an entire hospital ward drowning on dry land. Caretakers have reported dropping to their knees, clutching their ears to block out the overwhelming auditory assault of hundreds of phantom patients choking on their own dissolving lungs. The noise vibrates in the sternum. It feels entirely physical, a crushing wave of collective agony that demands to be heard. It is during this crescendo of auditory panic that the visual terror manifests. The human brain, overwhelmed by the deafening sound of unseen suffocation, frantically commands the eyes to search for the source. The beam of a heavy flashlight cuts through the dust-moated air, sweeping wildly across the empty beds and the graffiti-stained walls. But the threat does not walk on the floor. High above, pressed flat against the decaying ceiling plaster, a shape detaches itself from the darkness. It is an entity known only in the whispered lore of the property as the Creeper. The flashlight beam reveals a sprawling, ink-black silhouette roughly the size of a human, but its proportions are entirely wrong. Its limbs are elongated, spindly, and bent at impossible spider-like angles. It defies gravity, clinging to the smooth ceiling above the hallway with an unnatural tension. The Creeper does not float. It crawls. It moves with the rapid, twitching locomotion of an insect, scuttling across the ceiling tiles at a terrifying speed. As the choir of choking patients echoes endlessly through the ward, the shadowed entity darts from archway to archway, using the deep corners of the high ceilings to mask its approach. It makes no sound of its own, fully concealed by the deafening roar of the phantom coughing. Witnesses describe a paralyzing sense of predatory intent radiating from the shape. It descends the walls only to reposition itself, moving so fast that the eye can barely track its progression before it melds back into the blackness above. It is a manifestation of pure predatory dread, feeding off the residual energy of the suffering that permeates the brickwork. Those who encounter the midnight choir and the crawling shadow do not investigate further. The only rational response is retreat. Guards report backing away slowly, keeping their flashlight beams trained on the ceiling until they reach the heavy steel doors of the main stairwell. The descent down the concrete steps is always frantic, driven by the suffocating need to escape the heavy, diseased air of the upper floors. The sounds of the collective death rattle only begin to muffle once the heavy exterior doors are pushed open, allowing the freezing night air of the Kentucky woods to hit the face. But the silence outside never truly erases the experience. The trauma of the encounter lingers long after the shift ends. Those who walk the halls of Waverly Hills learn a grim reality about the nature of a haunting. The sanatorium is not simply a structure occupied by restless spirits. It is a massive architectural phonograph needle permanently stuck in the deepest groove of human agony, playing back the horrific reality of the White Plague to anyone unfortunate enough to listen in the dark. Next story. The Friendly Stranger on the Trail. The Appalachian Trail stretches for over 2,000 miles, a continuous ribbon of dirt woven through the oldest mountains in North America. Hikers call it the Green Tunnel. In the spring, the canopy grows thick, choking out the sunlight and wrapping travelers in a perpetual damp twilight. There is a deep, primal silence there, broken only by the crunch of boots on leaves and the distant calls of unseen birds. It is a place where people go to find peace, to leave the noise of civilization behind. But that same isolation demands a heavy toll. Out in the deep woods, miles from the nearest paved road, you are completely cut off from the world. There are no police, there are no sirens. If you scream, the sound is swallowed by a million ancient trees. In this quiet void, a specific culture has evolved, one built entirely on implicit trust. Hikers rely on each other. They share food, they share shelter, and they trust the strangers they meet at the end of a long day of walking. It is a beautiful system, fragile as glass. And when that glass violently shatters, it leaves a jagged, bleeding wound that the forest never forgets. In May of 1981, the trail through Virginia was blooming with new life. Robert Mountford and Laura Ramsey were 27 years old, far from their home in Maine. They were social workers, people who dedicated their lives to helping troubled youth and the marginalized. Their hearts were open, their demeanors naturally kind and empathetic. Taking time away from the heavy emotional toll of their professions, they had set out to hike the Appalachian Trail. By the time they reached Giles County, Virginia, they had already walked for weeks. They were hardened to the physical demands of the trail, their legs strong, their heavy packs settled perfectly against their shoulders. They had fallen into the hypnotic, repetitive rhythm of the long-distance hiker: wake at dawn, walk through the morning mist, rest in the afternoon heat, and find a wooden shelter before sunset. They knew the unwritten rules of the woods, they knew how to read a topographic map, how to filter stream water, and how to spot a friendly face. The culture of the trail dictates that fellow hikers and locals who frequent the path are kindred spirits. There is a common term, trail magic, used to describe the unexpected acts of kindness bestowed upon weary travelers. A cold drink left by a trailhead, a lift into a resupply town, or a local offering a warm fire and conversation at a shelter. When Robert and Laura approached the Wapiti shelter in the Jefferson National Forest, the sun was beginning its slow descent behind the ridges. The shadows stretched long and thin across the dirt. It was late afternoon, perhaps around 5 o'clock. Their bodies ached for rest. The shelter was a simple, three-sided wooden structure with a tin roof, a common sight along the trail, designed to offer a dry, elevated place to sleep. But they were not alone. A man was already sitting near the shelter. He looked like any other local who might wander up the mountain for a day of scouting or camping. He was young, in his late 20s, blending seamlessly into the rustic environment with his unkempt hair and rugged clothes. His name was Randall Lee Smith. At first glance, there was nothing remarkable or threatening about him. He greeted Robert and Laura with the familiar, easygoing charm that hikers expect from rural Virginians. He knew the woods intimately. He knew the trails. He offered them the kind of casual, soft-spoken conversation that eases the fatigue of a 20-mile day. Robert and Laura dropped their heavy packs, their muscles sighing in relief. They set out their foam sleeping pads and pulled out their small brass camp stoves to boil water for dinner. The atmosphere was light and welcoming. They shared the small dirt clearing with Smith, treating him with the same open-hearted trust they offered to everyone they met on their journey. They exchanged stories. They talked about the weather, the steep conditions of the path ahead, the quiet beauty of the surrounding forest. Smith listened, nodding, smiling softly at their anecdotes. He played the part of the friendly trail angel to absolute perfection. As the light faded from the sky and the cold, damp air of the mountain evening settled over the camp, the three of them sat near the shelter. The woods grew dark, transitioning into the kind of absolute, suffocating blackness that only exists miles away from electric lights. The only illumination came from the faint glow of the stars through the leaves and the beam of a single flashlight. Then, the atmosphere in the camp began to shift. It was not a sudden explosion of violence, but a slow, agonizing drop in the psychological temperature. The casual conversation naturally ebbed as the night deepened, but the silence that followed was not the comfortable, heavy-lidded quiet of tired travelers. It was taut, it was expectant. Robert and Laura, highly attuned to human behavior through their years of social work, might have felt the first subtle prickle of unease on the back of their necks. The friendly local was no longer making small talk. He was no longer looking at the trees or the dirt. He was just sitting, watching them. The horror of the Wapiti shelter did not begin with a shout or a sudden lunge. It began with the slow, deliberate death of a smile. The amiable, easygoing mask that Randall Lee Smith wore began to slip away, muscle by muscle. The warmth vanished entirely from his eyes, leaving behind a stare as cold, flat, and empty as a frozen lake. He was looking at Robert and Laura not as fellow human beings, not as interesting travelers from out of state, but as objects. The physical transformation in his posture was complete, and it was utterly terrifying. The realization of what was happening would have washed over the young couple like freezing water. They were not sharing a camp with a trail angel. They were trapped in a cage of trees with a predator. The silence of the deep woods suddenly turned deeply hostile. The chirping of the night insects sounded like a mocking chorus. The closest paved road was miles away over rough terrain. The nearest town was nothing but a distant rumor. There was no cell phone service in 1981, no handheld radios, no panic button to press. Every survival instinct they possessed was screaming that the man sitting just feet away from them was a lethal threat, but there was nowhere to run. The Appalachian Trail is treacherous at night, a twisting, narrow path of slippery roots and jagged rocks that would easily break an ankle in the pitch black. They were pinned down in the open front of the three-sided shelter, utterly exposed to the dark and to the man sitting in it. When Smith finally produced a weapon, the illusion of safety was permanently and violently shattered. The friendly stranger who had shared their evening, who had listened to their stories of Maine, who had smiled at their jokes, was now holding their lives in his hands. It is the ultimate paralyzing nightmare of the wilderness, the profound, unfathomable betrayal of trust. To look into the face of someone you just shared bread with, only to find a hollow, emotionless void looking back at you. He had played a game with them. He had sat patiently, waiting for the sun to disappear, waiting for them to take off their heavy boots, waiting for them to become completely physically and mentally vulnerable. The extreme isolation of the forest, once a source of deep spiritual comfort for the hikers, became an inescapable, suffocating trap. The ancient trees stood as silent, indifferent witnesses to the slow, methodical cruelty that was about to unfold. Robert Mountford and Laura Ramsey never walked out of the Jefferson National Forest. Their journey of self-discovery ended brutally in the dirt and wet leaves of Giles County. Robert was shot point blank. Laura fought desperately for her life, a frantic struggle in the dark woods, but was ultimately bludgeoned and stabbed to death. Smith dragged their bodies into the brush and buried them in shallow graves near the shelter, leaving their grieving families and the entire hiking community in a state of sheer devastation. When their remains were finally discovered days later, the inherent innocence of the Appalachian Trail was fractured beyond repair. The murders sent a permanent shockwave of paranoia through the tight-knit community of long-distance backpackers. The sacred, unwritten law of implicit trust had been violently violated. Decades later, the ghost of that betrayal still haunts the Long Green Tunnel. The original Wapiti shelter was eventually dismantled, torn down piece by piece to erase the physical reminder of the nightmare, but the mountain soil there retains the heavy memory. Every hiker who walks through the dense, darkening woods of Virginia must eventually grapple with a chilling knowledge. The greatest danger in the wild is not the black bears, nor the freezing weather, nor the treacherous rocky terrain. The true horror is the realization that a warm smile can be a hunting tactic, and that miles from the safety of civilization, the friendly stranger on the trail might just be waiting for the sun to go down. The visitation at the Phelps parsonage. The quiet township of Stratford, Connecticut, situated along the shadowy banks of the Housatonic River, was not a place accustomed to hysteria or public spectacle in the middle of the 19th century. It was a community rooted in the orderly conduct of daily life, governed by the rhythms of church bells and the changing seasons. The residents prided themselves on their rationality and pious dedication to the known world. In the year 1850, however, this composure was shattered by a series of events centering on a large, stately residence on Elm Street. The home belonged to the Reverend Eliakim Phelps, a Presbyterian minister of considerable repute and intellect. What transpired within the walls of his home would eventually draw the attention of the national press, confound the skeptics of the era, and leave a detailed record of phenomena that defies conventional explanation to this day. The events at the Phelps mansion remain one of the most meticulously documented cases of unexplained disturbances in American history, notable not for the shedding of blood, but for the orchestrated, almost theatrical nature of the psychological terror inflicted upon its inhabitants. Reverend Phelps was a man of logic. He was 60 years old at the time the disturbances began. A scholar who had graduated from Union College and had served various congregations with distinction. He was wealthy, having married a widow of means, and the family lived in a lifestyle that was comfortable and structured. The household included the Reverend, his wife, and 4 children, ranging in age from young childhood to adolescence. They were not a family given to superstition. The home they occupied was a spacious, high-ceilinged structure that exuded an air of permanence and safety. It was filled with heavy furniture, fine linens, and the accumulation of a prosperous life. There was no history of grim folklore attached to the land, no rumors of ancient curses that predated their arrival. The horror that descended upon them did not rise from the soil or the history of the house, but seemed to arrive abruptly and without invitation on a specific Sunday in early spring. On the morning of the 10th of March, 1850, the Phelps family attended church services, as was their custom. The house was left securely locked, the windows fastened, and the servants dismissed for the duration of the service. The day was typical for the season, with the chill of late winter still lingering in the air. When the family returned to the parsonage, they expected the silence of an empty house. Instead, they found the first sign that the fundamental laws of their reality had been altered. The front door was unlocked. Upon entering, the Reverend found the interior in a state of baffling disarray. It was not the chaotic ransacking of a thief looking for valuables, but something far more peculiar. Furniture had been moved to strange positions, not overturned, but rearranged. Chairs were placed in the center of rooms, ornaments were displaced. Yet, a quick inventory revealed that nothing of value had been stolen. The silver remained. The jewelry was untouched. The initial assumption was that an intruder was hiding within the walls, perhaps a prankster or a vagrant seeking shelter. The Reverend, armed with the indignation of a homeowner, conducted a thorough search of the premises. Every closet was opened, every corner inspected, from the cellar to the attic. No intruder was found. The windows remained latched from the inside. There was no mud on the floors to indicate a hasty entry or exit. Baffled, but unwilling to jump to irrational conclusions, the Reverend reset the house to its proper order, and the family attempted to resume their Sunday routine. They believed the incident to be an anomaly, a singular oddity that would likely never be repeated. They were incorrect. The disturbance on the 10th of March was merely the opening act of a siege that would last for months. Later that same afternoon, the family prepared for the second church service of the day. The Reverend, determined to secure his home, personally checked every fastening. He locked the doors and pocketed the keys. He ensured the windows were barred. When the family returned hours later, the scene that awaited them was far more disturbing than the morning's disarray. In the bedroom, the furniture was again scattered, but it was the details of the scene that caused a cold dread to settle in the stomachs of the witnesses. A nightgown belonging to Mrs. Phelps was laid out on the bed. Inside the gown, wrapped carefully in the fabric to mimic a body, was a chemise. The arms were folded across the chest in the posture of a corpse prepared for a coffin. Beside the bed, stockings and other garments were arranged on the floor in shapes that suggested prostrate figures. The arrangement of clothing became the signature manifestation of the Stratford disturbance. These were not merely piles of laundry tossed haphazardly, they were deliberate, complex sculptures made of fabric. On the following day, March 11, the phenomena escalated into the realm of the impossible. The Reverend and his family, now on high alert, found themselves discovering these tableaus in rooms that had been empty only moments before. In one instance, a room that had been unoccupied for 10 minutes was found to contain 11 distinct figures. These figures were constructed from the family's clothing, stuffed with pillows, bolsters, and mufflers to give them three-dimensional form. They were arranged with artistic precision. The figures were positioned in attitudes of devotion. Some were kneeling before the bed as if in prayer, others stood by the window, their empty sleeves gesturing toward the glass. Most unsettling of all, many of these fabric effigies held Bibles in their phantom hands. The Bibles were open, and upon closer inspection, the family found that they were open to specific passages regarding death, demons, and the judgment of the wicked. The speed at which these figures were constructed defied human capability. To create 11 such life-sized figures, stuff them realistically, and pose them with props would require a team of people working for half an hour or more. Yet, the room had been empty and silent, and the time elapsed between the Reverend checking the room and the discovery of the figures was often less than 5 minutes. The psychological impact of these silent, kneeling figures cannot be overstated. They were soundless intruders, mocking the piety of the household. They appeared in locked rooms where no human could have entered or exited without detection. The Reverend, a man of God, was forced to confront an intelligence that knew his home, knew his wardrobe, and knew his scriptures, using them to create scenes of grotesque theatrics. The family began to fear for their sanity. They reached out to friends, neighbors, and colleagues, hoping that fresh eyes might discover the trickery they were missing. This decision brought a stream of witnesses into the Phelps mansion, turning the private haunting into a matter of public record. Among the witnesses were fellow clergy, editors of local newspapers, and respected professionals from Stratford and neighboring towns. They came with skepticism, determined to find the wires, the hidden accomplices, or the mischievous children responsible for the hoax. They left baffled and shaken. One witness, a reporter, described standing in the parlor when a heavy brass candlestick, which had been resting securely on the mantelpiece, suddenly launched itself into the center of the room. It did not fall, it flew. It moved with a trajectory that suggested a forceful throw, yet no hand was near it. This marked a shift in the phenomena. The silent, static horror of the clothing figures gave way to kinetic violence. Inanimate objects began to exhibit a hostility toward the family, particularly toward the Reverend and his eldest son, a boy of 12 years also named Harry. The boy seemed to be a lightning rod for the activity. While in the presence of witnesses, Harry was lifted from the ground by unseen forces. On one occasion, he was carried across the room and deposited on a table without any visible means of support. His clothes were torn by invisible claws. He would cry out in pain, claiming to be pinched or pricked, and subsequent examination would reveal red welts and scratches on his skin. The terrifying aspect of these physical assaults was their selectivity. Other children in the house were largely ignored while Harry was tormented. This led some to whisper that the boy himself was the cause, a source of poltergeist energy, yet the phenomena frequently occurred when Harry was asleep, absent, or under the strict observation of multiple adults holding his hands. The violence against the house itself escalated. Windows became a primary target. In the span of a few weeks, no fewer than 71 panes of glass were smashed. The breaking of the glass followed a peculiar pattern. Sometimes the glass was shattered from the outside, sending shards inward. Other times the force came from within, exploding the glass onto the lawn. Witnesses standing near the windows reported seeing no stones or projectiles. The glass simply burst, as if under immense pressure or struck by an invisible hammer. The cost of the repairs began to mount, but the financial burden was secondary to the emotional toll of living in a home that was literally breaking apart around them. The Reverend Phelps, in a desperate attempt to understand the source of the persecution, attempted to communicate with the intelligence. This was the era when spiritualism was in its infancy, following the events in Hydesville, New York, only 2 years prior. While Phelps was a traditional theologian and initially resistant to such ideas, the sheer persistence of the phenomena wore down his resolve. Using a code of raps 1 for yes, 2 for no, and an alphabet system, he attempted to interview the presence. The answers he received were nonsensical, blasphemous, and contradictory. The entity, or entities, claimed to be damned souls, or sometimes messengers of the devil. At other times, the messages were merely gibberish, as if the force was incoherent or delighting in confusion. Vegetables and food items from the pantry were not safe from the corruption. On one occasion, a turnip fell from the ceiling, landing at the feet of a guest. When it was examined, it was found to have been carved with hieroglyphics that no one could decipher. Potatoes were found scattered in locked rooms. The mundane nature of these objects, vegetables, clothing, household knickknacks, contrasted sharply with the dread they inspired. It was a domestic terrorism, turning the safe and familiar tools of the household into weapons of fear. A heavy iron flat iron, used for pressing clothes, was witnessed by a neighbor to slide across the floor and strike the leg of a chair, breaking it. The physics of the movement were described as unnatural. The object did not tumble or roll, but slid as if pulled by a magnet. The auditory phenomena also increased in intensity. The family and their guests would hear loud poundings on the front door. When the door was thrown open, the porch would be empty, the street silent, the wrappings would move from the walls to the floor and then to the furniture. A large dining table was seen to rise several inches off the floor and drop with a crash. This occurred in full daylight, with sunlight streaming through the windows, dispelling the notion that the events were products of shadows and candlelight. The sheer volume of witnesses, some estimates suggest dozens of credible individuals, saw some portion of the phenomena made it difficult for the public to dismiss the events as mere hallucinations. One particularly harrowing incident involved the Reverend's daughter. She was walking up the stairs when she felt a presence behind her. A heavy pillow, which had been on a bed in a room down the hall, flew at her, striking her in the face. The force was sufficient to knock her backward. When the Reverend ran to investigate, he found the pillow lying on the stairs and the bedroom from which it had come completely empty. The trajectory required for the pillow to hit her at that angle was impossible to achieve from the doorway. It would have required the object to turn a corner in midair. Such violations of momentum and trajectory were common reported features of the Stratford disturbances. As the weeks turned into months, the stress on the Phelps family became unbearable. The Reverend was exhausted, his theology tested, his home a circus for the curious and the skeptical. The relentless nature of the haunting, the daily destruction, the constant noise, the terrifying effigies began to erode their resilience. They attempted to leave the house for short periods, but the phenomena often seemed to pause, only to resume with greater vigor upon their return. It was noted by observers that the activity seemed to feed on attention. The more people present, the more violent the manifestations. This led to a difficult paradox. To prove the haunting required witnesses, but witnesses seemed to fuel the fire. The effigies remained the most unique and disturbing aspect of the case. In total, dozens of these figures were constructed by the unseen force. They were not always abstract. Some were constructed with such attention to detail that they resembled specific family members. On one occasion, a figure was found wearing the Reverend's clothes, seated in his chair, with a posture so like his own that Mrs. Phelps initially mistook it for her husband. The realization that it was a hollow shell of clothing posed by invisible hands induced a fainting spell. The implication was that the entity was observing them closely, mimicking them, studying their habits and postures. It was a mockery of the living. Investigation into the possibility of fraud was extensive. Reverend Phelps was a man of high standing, but he was not immune to suspicion. However, the sheer logistics of the phenomena exonerated the family in the eyes of those who were actually present. The son, Harry, was often the prime suspect for skeptics reading the reports from afar. Yet, witnesses described objects moving in rooms where Harry was not present. They described heavy objects moving that a 12-year-old boy could not have thrown with such force without being seen. Furthermore, the complex effigies appeared in timeframes that would have been impossible for a boy to achieve without detection. To construct a life-size dummy from clothes, arrange it, and escape a room in 3 minutes was a feat of stage magic beyond the capacity of a pre-adolescent. By the autumn of 1850, the intensity of the disturbances began to wane, though they did not cease entirely. The violence lessened, replaced by a sporadic, sullen quiet. The phenomena burned themselves out, or perhaps the entity had achieved its inscrutable goal. The family eventually moved from the house, unable to live in a place that had been so thoroughly violated. The legacy of the Stratford knockings, as they came to be known, lingered long after the Phelps family departed. The house retained a reputation of unease. Future tenants reported minor disturbances, but nothing approaching the operatic scale of the events of 1850. The case remains a cornerstone of American paranormal history because of the credibility of the primary witness. Reverend Phelps was not a spiritualist seeking fame. He was a reluctant victim whose worldview was dismantled piece by piece. He never profited from the story. In fact, he suffered great financial loss due to the property damage and the cost of hosting investigators. His letters and journals from the time reflect a man in deep distress, seeking a rational answer and finding none. He died years later, never having recanted his testimony, maintaining to the end that what happened in his home was the work of an external, intelligent, and malicious power. One detail that often goes unmentioned in brief summaries is the lingering effect on the son, Harry. While he grew up to live a relatively normal life, the shadow of those months in 1850 followed him. He was forever the boy who had been lifted by spirits, the conduit for a chaos he could not control. The psychological scars of being the focus of such malevolent attention are difficult to quantify. In the archives of the era, the descriptions of the boy during the height of the haunting paint a picture of a child under siege, pale, frightened, yet strangely resigned to the impossibility of his situation. The phenomena at the Phelps mansion also included instances of apport, where objects appeared in the house that did not belong there. Strange nails, unknown utensils, and pieces of paper with cryptic writing appeared in locked rooms. These objects seemed to materialize from thin air. Conversely, items from the house would vanish, only to be found days later in impossible locations inside the hollow cavity of a wall or buried in the garden. This manipulation of matter, the passing of solid objects through barriers, the creation of complex sculptures, the generation of force without leverage suggested a mastery of physical laws that human science could not explain. The messages received through the wrappings were often recorded. They were frequently threatening or mocking. When asked what the spirits wanted, the answers were often mischief or ruin. There was no grand message of the afterlife, no comfort for the grieving, no philosophical revelation. It was a haunting of pure disorder. It was a chaotic intrusion that seemingly had no purpose other than to terrify and confuse. This lack of motive is perhaps the most frightening aspect of the Phelps case. It suggests that the barrier between the rational world and the irrational is thin, and that whatever lies on the other side requires no justification to cross over and tear a life apart. Today, the story of the Phelps Mansion is often overshadowed by more sensational, bloodier hauntings of the 20th century. Yet, for those who study the history of the unexplained, it remains a perfect haunting. It possesses all the elements of a nightmare: the subversion of the sanctuary of the home, the targeting of a child, the intelligent mockery of the victims, and the absolute inability of experts to solve the riddle. The image of the empty clothes, kneeling in the dark in silent prayer, remains one of the most chilling visuals in the annals of American folklore. It stands as a testament to the idea that the most terrifying ghosts are not the ones that scream, but the ones that silently mimic the living, waiting in the dark of a locked room for the door to open. The house in Stratford eventually underwent changes, its history buried under renovations and the passage of time. The specific energies that swirled there in 1850 dissipated into the ether. But the records remain. The newspaper clippings from the New Haven Journal, the letters from the Reverend to his colleagues, and the sworn affidavits of the witnesses are preserved in archives. They serve as a permanent reminder of the months when the rational world of Eliakim Phelps was suspended and his home became a theater for the impossible. The Stratford disturbances were never debunked. No wires were ever found, no confession was ever made. The case stands unresolved, a cold, hard knot of the inexplicable in the tapestry of New England history. Even the final departure of the family was marked by a sense of defeat rather than escape. They did not drive the spirits out, they merely retreated. The phenomena had proved its dominance. It had broken the windows, bruised the children, and mocked the master of the house with his own vestments. It had turned a sanctuary into a carnival of fear. As the carriages pulled away from Elm Street, carrying the exhausted family to a new life, the house stood silent, its secrets locked behind the battered doors. The wind from the river likely rattled the few remaining panes of glass, a natural sound in a place that had known so many unnatural ones. The haunting was over, but the question of what had walked the halls of the Phelps mansion remained and remains unanswered. The silent foundations of Newport. The promise of the American suburb in the early 1980s was one of order, predictability, and separation from the chaos of the urban sprawl. In Crosby, Texas, a small community located in the northeastern quadrant of Harris County, this promise was physically manifested in the development of the Newport subdivision. It was a place where the towering pine trees of the Texas woodlands met the manicured ambition of new construction, offering young families a slice of affordable prosperity. The homes were built with the confident architecture of the era, utilizing brick facades, expansive backyards, and the assurance of modern plumbing and electricity. The air in Crosby was thick with humidity and the scent of damp earth, a constant reminder of the region's proximity to the San Jacinto River. For the families who moved onto streets like Poppet's Way, the location felt like a sanctuary. It was quiet, removed from the industrial hum of Houston, and seemingly untouched by history. There was no reason to suspect that the ground beneath their foundations held anything other than the roots of ancient trees and the shifting clay of the Gulf Coast. The narrative of the Newport haunting does not begin with a storm or a sudden act of violence, but with a mundane domestic improvement project. In the stifling heat of a Texas summer, residents Sam and Judith Haney decided to install a swimming pool in their backyard. The decision was typical for the area, where the subtropical climate made outdoor recreation a necessity rather than a luxury. The excavation began with the standard machinery and manual labor required to displace tons of earth. The soil in this part of Texas is dense, often resisting the spade, heavy with clay and history. As the contractors and Sam Haney dug deeper into the yard, the rhythm of the work was interrupted not by rock or root, but by the discovery of wood. It was not the petrified remains of a fallen tree, but processed timber, rotting and soft from years of exposure to the damp soil. The initial assumption was that the excavators had hit a buried trash pit, or perhaps the debris from a previous unrecorded structure. However, as the dirt was cleared away with more caution, the shape of the wood became undeniable. It was a box. The dimensions were roughly that of a human form. The atmosphere in the backyard shifted from the noisy productivity of construction to a confused silence. When the lid of the box was breached, it revealed human remains. The discovery was stark and undeniable. It was not a single isolated burial. Further probing into the earth revealed another coffin nearby. The Haneys stood in their backyard, the sun beating down on the fresh dirt, looking into the faces of the dead who had been resting there long before the subdivision plat was ever drawn. The immediate aftermath involved the local authorities, but the situation did not fit the profile of a crime scene in the traditional sense. These were not fresh victims of a recent homicide, they were historical burials. The investigation revealed that the Haneys, and indeed their neighbors, were living on top of the old Black Hope Cemetery. It was a burial ground that had served a community of former slaves and their descendants, a sacred space that had been swallowed by time, neglect, and the aggressive expansion of real estate development. The graves were unmarked on modern maps, erased from the consciousness of the planners who poured concrete slabs over the resting places. The developers' records had not indicated a cemetery, or if they had, the information had not trickled down to the buyers who were now standing on the edge of open graves in their own property. Following the discovery, a decision was made that would prove to be the catalyst for the events that followed. The bodies were not moved to a new cemetery with ceremony and distance. Instead, due to legal and bureaucratic complexities, they were reburied. The pool project was abandoned or altered, and the earth was filled back in. The physical scars on the land were healed over with grass and landscaping, but the psychological and atmospheric rupture had occurred. The Haneys, and soon their neighbors, the Williams family, attempted to return to the normalcy of suburban life. They tried to rationalize the event as a grim historical footnote, a cocktail party story about the eccentricities of living in the South. But the environment within the homes began to change. The first sign that the balance of the location had been disturbed was a shift in the sensory details of the houses. Ben and Jean Williams, who lived in close proximity to the Haneys, began to report occurrences that defied mechanical explanation. It started with sounds. In the silence of the night, when the settling of a house is usually rhythmic and familiar, the Williams family heard footsteps. These were not the creaks of thermal expansion in the attic, but the distinct, heavy tread of boots walking across the floorboards in empty rooms. The sound was purposeful, pacing back and forth, suggesting a presence that was restless and confined. The auditory phenomena escalated to include the sound of doors opening and closing. Residents would sit in their living rooms, watching television or reading, only to hear the front door unlatch and swing open. Upon investigation, the door would be found locked and bolted, just as it had been left. The disconnect between what the ears heard and what the eyes verified created a growing sense of cognitive dissonance. The families began to doubt their own perceptions, checking locks repeatedly, creating a ritual of security that offered no protection against the intrusion. The sounds were soon accompanied by the manipulation of household infrastructure. Toilets would flush on their own in the middle of the night, the rush of water echoing through the quiet house like a signal. Faucets would turn on, water pooling in sinks before being discovered by sleep-deprived homeowners. Jean Williams, in particular, began to experience a profound sense of being observed. This was not merely a psychological reaction to the knowledge of the graves, it was a physical sensation of proximity. She reported the feeling of someone standing directly behind her while she washed dishes or folded laundry. The air in specific rooms would grow inexplicably cold, dropping in temperature rapidly even during the sweltering Texas afternoons. These cold spots were mobile, drifting through hallways and lingering in doorways, creating invisible barriers that the family members hesitated to cross. The children, too, were not immune. They spoke of shadows that moved independently of any light source, dark forms that would slide along the walls or stand at the foot of their beds. The visual manifestations began to take on more distinct shapes. The ambiguity of shadows gave way to specific apparitions. Witnesses in the neighborhood reported seeing a woman in a white dress. She was not transparent or vaporous in the way of cinematic ghosts. She was often described as looking solid, standing in the garden or near the property lines, staring toward the houses with an expression of confusion or sorrow. Other figures were less benign. Ben Williams recounted waking up to see gray, undefined forms hovering near the bed. These forms did not have clear facial features, but radiated a sense of heaviness and despair. The experience was often accompanied by a paralysis, a physical inability to move or call out, as if the atmosphere of the room had become pressurized. As the months passed, the haunting of Newport began to manifest in the physical health of the residents. This phase of the phenomenon moved beyond the paranormal into the biological. The families living on the disputed ground began to suffer from a series of unexplained illnesses. There was a pervasive lethargy that settled over the households, a fatigue that sleep could not cure. Gene Williams and others reported strange rashes appearing on their skin, dermatological issues that doctors struggled to diagnose. The plants in the homes and in the gardens, previously lush and thriving in the Texas sun, began to wither and die despite attentive care. It was as if the soil itself had turned toxic, rejecting the life that tried to take root above it. The behavior of animals in the subdivision provided another layer of unsettling evidence. Family pets, usually docile and comfortable, began to exhibit signs of extreme stress. Dogs would bark incessantly at empty corners of the rooms or refuse to enter certain parts of the house. Cats would stare fixedly at invisible points in the air, their fur standing on end, before bolting in terror. There were reports of birds dying in the yards in unusual numbers, not from predation, but seemingly dropping from the air. The natural world around the homes seemed to be reacting to a disturbance that the human residents were only beginning to understand. The instinctual fear displayed by the animals served to validate the unease of the owners. It was a confirmation that the tension in the air was not a product of human imagination. The psychological toll on the Williams and Haney families became severe. The sanctuary of the home had been inverted. The place where they should have felt safest was now the source of their greatest anxiety. Sleep became a commodity that was rarely obtained. The nights were spent in a state of hypervigilance, listening for the sound of the flushing toilet, the footsteps, or the murmurs of conversation that seemed to drift from the walls. Some residents reported hearing their names called out when no one else was home, a mimicking of familial voices that was particularly disturbing. The stress began to fracture the social fabric of the neighborhood. Neighbors who had once gathered for barbecues now gathered to compare notes on the impossible events occurring in their homes, their conversations hushed and laced with fear. One of the most disturbing physical manifestations involved the sensation of touch. Residents reported feeling invisible hands brushing against them, or in some cases, pushing them. There were accounts of bed sheets being pulled off in the night, slowly and deliberately, as if by an unseen hand at the foot of the bed. This physical interaction crossed a significant threshold. It was one thing to hear a noise or see a shadow, it was another to be touched by the phenomenon. It implied a level of agency and capability on the part of the entities that was terrifying. The boundaries of personal space were violated, leaving the residents feeling vulnerable and exposed even when locked inside their bedrooms. The environmental phenomena around the houses also escalated. Sinkholes began to open up in the yards. The ground, which had been disturbed by the construction and the excavation of the graves, seemed unstable. These were not massive geological events, but small, sudden collapses of Earth that served as a physical reminder of the hollowness beneath the turf. The sight of the ground opening up was symbolic of the precarious position the families found themselves in. They were literally and metaphorically sinking into a history that had been covered up. The smell of jasmine was often reported during these times, a cloying, sweet scent that would appear suddenly and without a source, often preceding a wave of paranormal activity. In other instances, the smell was foul, resembling rotting meat or sulfur, permeating the house and then vanishing as quickly as it had arrived. The Williams family attempted to fight back against the encroachment. They sought explanations from the developer, they looked into the history of the land, and they tried to assert their ownership of the space. However, the activity only seemed to intensify in response to their resistance. The electronics in the house became unreliable, lights would flicker and blow out bulbs with expensive frequency, televisions would turn on and off, or the volume would surge to maximum levels without input. The chaotic energy seemed to interfere with the electrical currents of the home, creating a physical environment that was as unstable as the psychological one. One particular incident that stands out in the collective memory of the neighborhood involved the appearance of ants. In a horror-like surge of nature, the Williams home was invaded by thousands of ants. They did not come for food or water in the usual patterns of infestation. They poured out of the electrical outlets and the baseboards in a swarm that covered walls and floors. Exterminators were called, poisons were sprayed, but the insects seemed relentless. It was an infestation that felt biblical in its intensity, a plague that defied standard pest control methods. The ants, like the sinkholes and the dying birds, were seen by the family as a rejection by the land itself. As the situation became untenable, the families sought legal recourse. They filed a lawsuit against the developer, claiming that the failure to disclose the existence of the cemetery had led to their financial and emotional ruin. This legal battle brought the haunting of Newport into the public record. It was no longer just a ghost story whispered between neighbors. It was a matter of court documents and testimony. The jury heard the accounts of the mental anguish, the loss of value, and the unlivable conditions. While the court could not rule on the existence of ghosts, it could rule on the negligence of building over a graveyard. The lawsuit provided a secular framework for these supernatural events, anchoring the horror in the reality of property law and civil liability. However, the legal victory, such as it was, could not exorcise the houses. The Williams family, the Haneys, and others eventually came to the realization that they could not stay. The decision to leave was not made lightly. It involved walking away from their investments, their credit ratings, and the dreams they had built. But the alternative was to remain in a place that was actively hostile to their presence. The departure was a chaotic retreat. Packing up boxes in a house where the walls seemed to watch you was a hurried and terrifying process. There was a fear that the phenomenon might follow them, that the residue of the Black Hope Cemetery had attached itself to their possessions or their spirits. When the families finally moved out, the houses stood empty. The silence returned to pop its way, but it was a heavy, loaded silence. The lawns, once manicured, began to overgrow. The windows, which had once framed the lives of young families, now looked out blankly onto the street. Reports from subsequent visitors or those who drove by the abandoned properties described a lingering sense of dread. The air around the lots felt cooler than the surrounding neighborhood. Shadows were still seen moving in the windows of the empty houses, suggesting that the entities were not residual replayings of the living, but permanent residents who had reclaimed their territory. The legacy of the Newport haunting is not just in the scare tactics of moving objects or ghostly apparitions, but in the profound violation of the domestic sanctuary. The case highlighted the deep, often uncomfortable relationship between the present and the past. The development of the land had been an act of erasure, an attempt to pave over a community's history with concrete and St. Augustine grass. The haunting was, in many ways, the history refusing to be erased. The bodies in the ground, the Black Hope of the cemetery's name, asserted their presence through the very infrastructure that was meant to suppress them. In the years that followed, the story of the Black Hope Cemetery became a local legend, a cautionary tale about the price of progress and the importance of respecting what lies beneath. The houses were eventually resold, reoccupied, or in some cases modified, but the stigma remained. The people who lived through it, Ben and Jean Williams, Sam and Judith Haney, carried the scars of the experience for the rest of their lives. Jean Williams, in her later accounts, spoke with a weariness that went beyond simple fear. She spoke a fundamental shift in her understanding of the world, a realization that the barrier between the living and the dead is porous and easily broken by the blade of a shovel. The reconstruction of these events reveals a pattern of escalation that is typical of profound hauntings but unique in its environmental scope. It was not one house, but a cluster. It was not one family, but a community. The phenomenon was tied inextricably to the land. The activity did not start until the ground was broken for the pool, suggesting that the earth itself was the containment vessel for the unrest. Once the seal was broken, the energy released was indiscriminate. It affected the devout and the skeptical alike. It manifested in the electrical wiring and the biology of the residents. Even today, the area around Newport retains a certain notoriety. While new residents may not know the specifics of the Williams or Haney ordeal, the archival records of the lawsuit and the newspaper reports from the era stand as a testament to the events. The haunting was never solved in the traditional sense. There was no exorcism that cleared the air, no ritual that put the spirits to rest. The living simply retreated, ceding the ground back to the dead. The sinkholes were filled, the grass was cut, but the knowledge of what lay 6 feet under and what walked the halls at night remained. The ambiguity of the case persists. Skeptics have pointed to the stress of the lawsuit, the power of suggestion, and the presence of mold or environmental toxins as potential explanations for the hallucinations and illnesses. Yet, these explanations fail to account for the simultaneous experiences of multiple independent witnesses, the physical movement of objects observed by groups, and the specific, verified history of the burial ground that was initially unknown to the residents. The Black Hope horror stands as a disturbing intersection of sociology, history, and the paranormal, a reminder that some foundations are too deep to be built upon, and some debts to the past are collected in ways that defy the laws of the physical world.